The evolution of public education in British Columbia has been marked by new initiatives and passionate responses, innovative practices, and new challenges. What has been a constant theme is the importance of delivering quality public education that enriches the learning experience for students of all ages. Rob Tierney, the Dean of Education at the University of British Columbia, joins me on the program today. From professional development to special education needs, we'll look at the current education landscape in this province and what it may look like in the near future if our key challenges are met, or in turn, if they are not. I'm Paul Shaker, and this is an Education Matter. Rob, from knowing you, I know that you were raised in Australia, did a lot of your preparation and career in the United States, and then have come to British Columbia for a good number of years now and been leader of education at UBC. So you have quite a broad context. In addition to these experiences, I know that you go to Europe, for example, to study and to present. So given this international perspective that you have on education, I think it would be a benefit for our audience to hear some of your appraisal of the public education system that we have here in British Columbia.
Okay, well, thanks, Paul. I want to say it's great to be here. Great to have a conversation with you about educational ideas and to talk about British Columbia. I've been here since 2000. My educational career, apart from being a student, actually starts back in Australia in '67. And you're right, I've worked in several countries now. I've always been very impressed with BC. And my view of BC is that it's always done very well in terms of international assessments, whether it be the PISA studies, the international reading assessments, the science assessment. Alberta and BC seem to always be towards the top in Canada and ahead of most countries, including some of the best performing countries in the world, such as New Zealand. More importantly, I actually think the talent pool up here of educators is extraordinary. Historically, the curriculums coming out of BC have been as good as you can get anywhere in the world. I think there's a little bit of a lag right now in a couple of areas, but I actually do think the talent, the relationship with schools, the working together of school people, university folk, other stakeholder groups in the government is pretty extraordinary. And so I'm actually fairly encouraged by the situation here. It has a great history to build upon, and at a time of rapid change in the world, I think it's well positioned to make some advances. I think in education, what we experience is a little bit like having to climb up an escalator that's going down. And one of the dangers one has is if one is not moving forward, one's going to find oneself behind. And as part of walking forward, BC really needs to come to grips with some significant challenges and what the future should be.
Before we get into those challenges, I wanted to say that it's my experience too in coming to BC after a career in other places, including countries not in North America, that I was very impressed with the education here, both by quantitative measures and by my own qualitative experience of the place. The world could come here to study education as they do in places like Finland, for example. Now it's very vogue to go study what the Finns are doing. And the frustration for me is that because newspapers and politicians often want to make hay out of controversy or criticism, I'm afraid that the public doesn't always realize and celebrate the accomplishments that have been made here, because it's so important to people in the classroom to feel appreciated by the public. You know, people in education work as much for the non-material rewards of the job as for the material ones. And we wouldn't want our teaching corps and our principals and superintendents to be demoralized by accountability movements or criticism in media and this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I'm very impressed. I actually do think we are walking the talk.
Good.
In a lot of areas. There are a couple of areas where I'm not sure the talk has started and it needs to. And there are a few areas where we're talking but yet to walk as much as we should. But I actually do think we're making progress, and I agree with you. It's much to do with the talent, commitment, the motivation of the people who educate us. in the communities, particularly the public schools.
Yes, if you can attract a high caliber of people to a field, whatever it is, then most of the battle is over. As we know from testing, if you're testing the right segment of the population, you're going to have great test scores too.
Yeah.
So Rob, I know that you have some priorities that you think we in BC should attend to. So if you could imagine that you had the power to set the agenda for where we focused our resources in education, would you start walking us through some of those priority matters?
Yes. Well, let me talk about what I see as the challenging areas. Whereas I'm very positive about what BC's achieved, there are for some groups some major challenges. In some respects, BC doesn't look unlike the US relative to the success or lack of success of some groups. We all know the situation in terms of the of Aboriginal students, many of them not actually completing high school. I actually think that's comparable to any city, inner city US, and to me that's a significant problem. I think there are a lot of significant efforts at universities and the schools to change that situation, and I see leadership initiatives which are increasing the leadership in Aboriginal communities, as well as the talent pool of teachers out of Aboriginal communities for Aboriginal communities. But the data on the Aboriginals has stayed pretty constant. In other words, I'm not seeing as much of a decline in the dropout rates of Aboriginal students as I think we need to come to grips with. I actually think we need to provide more support earlier for all of our Aboriginal students and our Aboriginal communities. We've got to invest in our teachers in the Aboriginal communities, and we've got to look for ways to actually help communities develop. One of the things that I worry most about is cultural sustainability. I know we talk a lot about climate issues and the gas tax or the carbon tax, but one of the major concerns I have is what's actually happening to Indigenous cultures across BC, particularly related to language issues, and where we're seeing the disappearance of Indigenous language despite our best attempts to resurface them and redevelop them. So I think from my perspective, one of the major challenge areas has to do with the Aboriginal communities, which connects with another major challenge that BC has, due to its size, is rural communities. There are 13 rural communities at least, maybe 16 I think, that are more than 200 kilometres from the nearest access road. There are about 16, or around about total about 23 to 30 communities that are more than 100 kilometres from the nearest access road. These people deserve the same quality of support that they get in health, in education. And so I actually think what we've got to do is to look at issues of access and equity, not only across the Aboriginal communities throughout the province, but also in terms of other rural communities, where we're seeing turnover in teachers and challenges the community where they may not be able to get the special needs support in particular that the students need.
We had Chris Stewart on our program this year, and she's, of course, one of our most respected Aboriginal educators in the province, and in influential roles throughout her career. And she talked about experiments that connected the schools to the Aboriginal community more, and how that was promising to her to see experiments like that were going on. So what I want to pose to you is perhaps the arrangements that we traditionally use with schools can't work for some of these communities. Her thesis was that we needed a bit different arrangements in the way the school interfaced with the community if we were going to succeed with these populations.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think we need a developmental relationship with all the communities throughout the province, where we're making sure we meet the needs of their teachers and the communities as we meet the needs of their students. And that might be figuring out ways to provide integrated support, figuring out ways to address the teacher turnover issues. In Aboriginal communities, we've got teachers who may be there for less than a year. How do we actually develop retention approaches? How do we actually help them with professional development? And how do we help their students get access to the same qualities of support that they get in the Lower Mainland, for example?
Accountability movements have a tendency to make a one-size-fits-all culture, and this is one of the problems that experimental operations, as she was speaking about, have. If they're forced to meet the same standards by the same measurements that traditional schools are on the same time frame, like annually, it can inhibit innovation. I don't know if you see the means of accountability as being a part of this attempt to innovate with certain school populations.
Oh, interesting. I do. I think there needs to be a regard and respect and a building from culture and backgrounds of experiences and opportunities rather than a displacement of that by testing, which doesn't really assess what people, the literacies of those communities. And I think in terms of First Nations issues, particularly Aboriginal issues, there's been a marginalisation of their knowledge and ways of knowing in schools, which I think now is being challenged. And so, as I said, I think in that area, I think we have begun to walk the talk, but we're not there yet.
Yes. Well, after my career in education, I do feel more strongly than ever that whenever you can, you should build the schools up from the neighborhoods and communities they're in. And only when there isn't the social capital in that place should you begin to impose from outside. Right. When you can build a school up from the grassroots, it seems to me you get by far the most successful school.
Right. And the school development needs to occur concurrently with the cultural and the economic development in those communities. Otherwise, you'll find education developments outstripping economic developments and basically going nowhere in the long run.
Well, it flies in the face of a lot of the trends that we've seen in the last 100 years of trying to treat education as if it were an assembly line and it were a giant corporation, and it would be best if Wall Street or Ottawa or somewhere far away set the priorities and the techniques.
But you've also mentioned another issue in the province, and there is a level of investment issue that some communities face and the province faces. In some cases, the budgeting model for the province doesn't work relative to the needs of some communities. I think I know the government realises it, particularly where you've got a decline in the rural populations, is how do you create a budget model which actually makes sure you get adequate resources sufficient to meet the needs of these communities. And whereas you might see trends where educational funding has increased, the key measure from my perspective is, does that school, do those students actually get the resources they need, and what level of investment needs to be in place to do that? Okay. And I certainly see that in the area of literacy and special ed as a significant area that the province really has to come to grips with.
Okay. Well, we'll pick that up in a moment, and we'll be back for more after this message.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Here on the program today is Rob Tierney. Rob, you've been walking us through some of the priorities that you see from your point of view for British Columbia to attend to in public education. You've talked about Aboriginal education and a very related subject, rural education. What's the next priority you'd like to talk with us about?
Well, my field is literacy, and I would love to talk about literacy, particularly given that the Premier has declared the goal of making BC the most literate province in Canada. And I'm impressed with the volunteerism that's being supported, but I'm impressed with the talk, but not the walk. We probably have one of the strongest pools of experts in literacy of any place in the world, certainly in North America, across our faculties, in our schools. Those people are not part of the conversation. We have, I think, three needs in schools. We need teachers to be well prepared in terms of literacy. which we can get a start on in our teacher education programs, but we need to do more than that. We need in schools qualified literacy personnel who can meet the specialised needs, the children who are potentially falling behind. The investment in those people gives you an incredible return over time and certainly would compensate for the cost. Those people, school boards are struggling to find funds to support those people. And we need people at the provincial level that are engaged in meaningful conversations about what's actually happening and what the needs are in literacy. One of my big concerns is the fact that BC seems to have forgotten that in the world out there, there are 21st century new literacy skills that involve the internet, information access, networks and other types of things that students in the margins of schools are spending more time on than they are in terms of the traditional print literacies. Our schools, I think, in BC are woefully behind the type of curriculum development and professional development that's occurring elsewhere in the world. In Australia, for example, every high school kid is given a laptop now by the government. In Finland, each teacher is given 5 weeks of full-time professional support in the new literacy. In places like Mexico, the government is striving to actually have internet connection for every household. Yet in BC, compared with, for example, Singapore, I don't see very much occurring except in isolated circumstances. If we're really wanting to climb that escalator that's going down, we need to catch up to where the rest of the world is and moving very quickly to. So that's an area that I see as needing to invest in a huge way for all our students, but also for those students who might be struggling with traditional literacy as well as the new print literacy. What's really interesting is if you look at what we know about students' literacy, adolescents now are spending more time on the screen or instant messaging and than they are reading print. About 4 or 5 years ago, the data that's collected sort of showed that kids had actually moved to spending at least slightly around an hour a day at least on the internet and other sorts of electronic communication devices versus dealing with regular print. Yet in school, we seem to be acting, in schools in BC, not elsewhere in the world necessarily, we seem to be acting as if the print is still almighty. We need to help our students actually be participants in the 21st century literacy skills, not just the observers on the margins of schools.
I can imagine a viewer saying, well, what's the difference? You know, you read off a screen, you read off a printed page. And I think that one of the factors here is, for example, when we read it off the screen, we're getting this world of blogs and of unedited content. So there's more of a need than ever, for example, for media criticism, for a critical faculty to be brought to bear when you're taking in information. But are there any other specifics about what it is that we would be doing with a student in class that makes a different experience for that student of expressing literacy as they interact with a screen as opposed to a printed page?
I think there are 3 things which are really important to realize. The informational strategies that a kid uses on screen or on the internet, whatever, do not necessarily correlate with their abilities on the regular print environment. I do think that one of the abilities that they need is how to access and evaluate information, how to pull together information from various sources because they're being bombarded with it right now, how to deal with visual literacies, and by that, the massive media, the world of video, and how to participate in communities. I mean, all of a sudden we're dealing with learning being done at a community level, or communities level, plural, rather than just individually. And to be a literate person, one has to learn how to navigate in concert with other communities. So in those 3 ways, I mean, how one accesses information, incorporating the new media, particularly the visual media, video, into an interface, and then how one participates in a world of 2.0, where one is a knowledge producer, not just a recipient of that knowledge, and is doing that in partnership with a full community of people. The potential of this for rural issues, by the way, is huge. So, you know, again, I want to sort of say, I think we need qualified people in schools to support kids in all aspects of literacy, and we need to invest in this new literacy. Singapore, for example, if you walk into a science lab in Singapore, you'll see DNA testing facilities connected to computers for high school kids. If you walk into a science lab here, you won't see very much different from what you saw 25 years ago.
I detected a note of frustration in your 3 points about the continuity between governments accessing the university's resources and then feeding that into the schools. And I know that doing a similar job to yours in the past at SFU, I was disappointed that the Deans of Education didn't have a seat at the Education Roundtable. I too feel that there's a discontinuity and all the partners aren't sharing information as well as they could, and as a university person, I certainly felt left out. And as you're saying about our reading expertise, we also have that in English language learning, for example. And I didn't feel those people, and in curriculum, some of our talented faculty who would like to be contributing more in BC, for some reason weren't able to get their ideas into the mix here as well as they wished.
I do think in some areas the government's been open. In the area of literacy, I find myself a little frustrated, and primarily because I see so much need there. And I see kids who are having difficulty, who need support of qualified people, and I see these new literacy things happening elsewhere in the world, but not here. I also see another issue in BC which relates to what you just said, is the language minority students. If we were to identify the groups that are having difficulty in schools, one is the Aboriginal students, but the other one is certain language minority students, where they're not getting through high school. And oftentimes kids from, for example, Southeast Asia or other parts of the world, in contrast with China and Korean students in our schools, they're having quite a bit of difficulty. And so how do we actually prepare teachers to be the cultural, working across these different cultural groups with different languages in the schools that we have in the Lower Mainland, for example, where I think they estimate there are about 140 different language groups, not all of whom are succeeding.
Well, and among your priorities, I suspect special ed enters in also.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So would you bring special education into this discussion?
My sense is, and my knowledge is, the government is actually investing money in preparing more special ed teachers. But what we also need to see is support at the school level so that special ed teachers can actually be used in meaningful ways, sometimes in one-to-one situations, in small group situations, for the kids who need support. There's a shortage of school psychologists. I think the provincial government is trying to meet that need, but there's shortages in learning disabilities, and this relates again to literacy. All teachers need to be able to provide a lot of support for all kids in the classroom, but there also needs to be the funding and the resources whereby when you need a highly qualified person with specialized skills to help teachers and parents deal with kids who are autistic, kids who've got different sorts of learning disabilities, kids who are visually challenged or having hearing challenges. I mean, we need to figure out what we need to do to make sure that those kids' needs are being met. I think the government is trying, but I don't think we're there yet. And so that's a case where I think we are walking in part the talk, but not to the extent to which we need to. Oftentimes faculties of education get charged with, well, you're not preparing teachers to do this. But the reality is we are preparing teachers to meet the needs of a classroom of kids, and we also are preparing teachers to meet the special needs of kids who need more help. What we also need are the resources going through the school boards whereby these people are employed, and the government saying to the school boards, you need to be hiring qualified people who provide that specialized care. And the sooner they do it with kids, in other words, the earlier they do it with kids, the return on the investment in that is much greater than the eventual costs that would be entailed.
Well, and of course, our aspiration in teacher education is to prepare a beginning teacher. And we have one of the shortest preparation times of any profession to enter a professional into the marketplace. And then we expect there'll be professional development and a career ladder of learning to take that person to the proper level, and resource persons around them, because no one can be specialized in every aspect.
Well, I think there's a huge turnover in teachers right now. A lot of new teachers in US, by the way, they're estimating a 50% turnover of teachers in the next 5 years as people retire and as people leave the field. What we need to do is to make sure in those initial years we provide the support by which these people can really refine their skills, and we continue to provide that support throughout their career. If we're in medicine, we'd be doing the same sort of thing. If we're in other, in the health areas, we would be doing it. We need to be doing it in education. The government's providing some funding for some groups to do that, but not on a province-wide fashion at this point.
Thank you.
Okay.
More on this discussion when we come back. The rate of change in society continues to increase exponentially, and education is very much caught up in these transformations. It takes the best energies of our scholars and educational leaders to hypothesize how our educational institutions should adapt to emerging conditions. Even more problematic for renewal is bringing along the political system that ultimately controls education. Past evidence suggests we are slow to apply our best insights to education policy, as in the example of evaluation being caught up in vain efforts at test-driven accountability. Open, committed dialogue among stakeholder groups could alter the status quo and promote beneficial change instead of sound bites, pointless controversy, and unintended consequences. Education may be the key institution for adapting society to change, and open communication is vital to this process. Thank you for watching Your Education Matters.
For more information about this show, or to view past episodes, go to the Your Education Matters website at www.youreducationmatters.ca. The views and opinions presented in this program are not necessarily those of all faculties, staff, or administration at SFU.